And good afternoon. You're listening to Ken Hudnall. This is the Ken Hudnall Show. Coming to you from our studios right here in exciting El Paso, Texas. Gateway to the Old West and the most haunted city in the country. Well, today is April the 13th, the 103rd day of this year. Just 262 days remain to the year's over with. Holidays and observances. International Plant Appreciation Day, International F&D Awareness Day, National Silly Earrings Day, and International Special Librarians Day. There's a long laundry list of holidays and observances on this April 13th. We're not going to cover all of them by any means. Let's see what stories we have in the news, because this is a year of unbelievably outstanding news. Well, President Trump has voiced frustration with NATO, says the Iranian Navy destroyed as the U.S. prepares for blockades. He addressed several pressing international conflicts after stepping off Air Force One in Maryland on Sunday, declaring the Iranian naval force had been destroyed ahead of a planned energy blockade and expressing a sharp disapproval of NATO for its perceived lack of support. He said their military is destroyed, their navy is underwater. 158 ships are gone. Their entire navy is gone. Most of their mine droppers are gone. At 10 o'clock tomorrow, we have a blockade going into effect. Other nations are working so Iran won't be able to sell oil. He further underscored the U.S. Independence, asserting the international vessels are bypassing troubled routes in favor of purchasing American oil. We got another story. Vice President Vance, U.S. negotiators depart the meeting with Iran, Pakistan delegation, after the peace talks fail. Vice President Vance and U.S. left planned talks in Pakistan this weekend after failing to reach a ceasefire deal with Iran. He held a bilateral meeting Saturday with Pakistan Prime Minister Sharif in Islamabad ahead of negotiations with Iran, according to an announcement from the White House. Sharif played a key role in brokering the U.S.-Iran ceasefire that President Trump announced earlier this week. However, Iran's lead negotiator on Friday warned their talks in Pakistan wouldn't begin unless Lebanon also sees a ceasefire. Iran's president said the deal will be reached if the U.S. abandons its totalitarianism. In other words, you may have won the war, but you have to agree that we're going to win the peace. Well, Bruce Springsteen's former drummer pushes back on the boss's political attacks on President Trump. He said, you got to have respect. Bruce Springsteen's former drummer, Vinny Lopez, is speaking out against the boss for slamming President Trump while on his Land of Hope and Dreams tour. This is kicking off the tour in Minneapolis March 31st. Springsteen, who's 76, has repeatedly unleashed blistering attacks on Trump during his shows. The last administration is corrupt and incompetent and racist and reckless and treasonous, and mocking the 79-year-old as a president who can't handle the truth, among other insults. What Springsteen doesn't seem to understand, people go to concerts not to be lectured about politics, but to be entertained. And Springsteen is, when he gets on his horse, he is not entertaining by any means. Well, Alex Swalwell is exiting the governor's race. He's running for California governor, apologizing for past judgment while denying the claims that he sexually assaulted a member of his staff. Said he's suspending his campaign for California governor, citing personal issues and ongoing allegations in a statement posted on X. He wrote, I'm suspending my campaign for governor. To my family, staff, friends, and supporters, I'm deeply sorry for mistakes and judgment I've made in my past. He said, I'll fight the serious false allegations that have been made, but that's my fight, not the campaign's. The decision comes as pressure mounted over sexual assault allegations published in a bombshell report from the San Francisco Chronicle on Friday, with lawmakers from both parties calling on him to drop out of the race and resign from Congress. And this is a man who made his name attacking President Trump. Well, Heidi Klum is unrecognizable in a dramatic Coachella disguise as techno-hexen. She loves the theme, no question about that. Supermodel looked barely recognizable. She frolicked around the Coachella Valley Music and Arts Festival over the weekend in Indio, California. She's 52, smiled wildly. She raised arms while walking the grounds of the Empire Polo Field wearing a jet black wig with mirrored sunglasses over her eyes. She wrote Coachella Day 2, techno-hexen. Germany's Next Top Model host wrote with a social media clip shared Saturday. She sported a sheer white gown with layers of fabric cascading down to her chest and tucked into the back of a lacy pair of bottoms. Slung a back leather bag across her shoulders and trekked through the dusty venue wearing fishnets with black and white leather cowboy boots. Mother of four made an equally impressive fashion statement the night before to kick off the festival. Well, I guess even the host of Next Top Model has to dress down periodically. Well, Catholic nuns caring for dying patients fight the New York trans rule. They face jail time. Catholic nuns who spent more than a century caring for the dying poor are suing New York Governor Kathy Hochul, saying a new state law would force them to choose between their faith and their mission or to face fines, loss of licensing, and even jail time. They said, we're consecrating religious sisters and have one mission. Mother Marie Edward, OP, told Fox News Digital in a statement. They provide comfort and skilled care to people dying of cancer who can't afford nursing care. We don't take insurance or government funds or money from our patients or families. The care is totally free. We're supported by the goodness of our benefactors, she said. Well, signed into law November 30, 2023, the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender and People living with HIV Long-Term Care Facility Residents Bill of Rights bans long-term care facilities and staff from discriminating against any resident on the basis of a resident's actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression, or HIV status, according to press release from Hochul's office. Dominican Sisters of Hawthorne, who run the Rosary Hill Home in Hawthorne, New York, filed a lawsuit Tuesday against a law they say would require them to assign the rooms by gender identity, not biological sex, allow access to the opposite sex bathrooms, and allow expression in relationships and identity practices, use preferred pronouns, require staff training in gender ideology, and post a public notice stating compliance with the law. Well, for some reason, the left, and Kathy Hochul certainly on the left, just cannot get away from the DEI plans that they keep trying to put into effect. Well, Barron Trump's beverage brand has unveiled its first flavors ahead of launch. Palm Beach-based startup listing Barron Trump as a director is preparing to launch its Yerba Mate drinks online in May. First son Barron Trump's new beverage ventures announced its first two flavors ahead of its planned launch, which is now set for the month of May. Solos Yerba Mate, headquartered in Mar-a-Lago, revealed the news in a LinkedIn post last week. Introducing our 12-pack pineapple and coconut, the company said, launching in May 2026. The announcement comes after the 19-year-old youngest son of President Donald Trump was listed as a director of the Palm Beach, Florida-based beverage company, going to a January SEC filing in Florida and Delaware. Product's going to be available for purchase online at solos.com, the company said. Well, everybody's got to have a hobby, no question about that. Well, doctors expose the buffalo hump as a potential sign of hidden health conditions. Fatty bulge at the base of the neck, commonly known as the buffalo hump, isn't always just a cosmetic concern. Experts say it can sometimes signal an underlying condition. As more Americans grapple with poor posture, obesity, and chronic conditions requiring long-term medications, experts warn that these factors can contribute to the development of the so-called buffalo hump. There are a range of possible causes and treatments for this commonly misunderstood condition, according to health.com. Buffalo hump is a fullness at the base of the neck or the upper back area, according to Dr. Dahlia Rice, a Chicago-based plastic surgeon and founder of DMR Aesthetics. Posture.com makes a hump appear more, posture can make a hump appear more pronounced, even if somebody doesn't have much excess fat. A forward head posture, a rounding of the upper spine, can contribute to this effect. Depending on the pattern and the timing, can also signal an underlying medical issue. So if you've got one, you might check with your local doctor and see if there's an underlying medical cause. Well, the quantum mystery may explain how God knows every thought you have. For millennia, the concept of an omniscient God, a deity who knows every sparrow that falls and every thought that forms and every star that burns across the vast expanse of the cosmos, has boggled the human imagination. How in the world can any entity, no matter how supreme, know everything that's happening everywhere all at once in real time and with atomic level intimacy? Well, to the strict materialist, it sounds like an impossibility. It wonders from a completely illogical relic of ancient philosophies and religions. When one plumbs the depth of modern physics, you discover something utterly profound. The concept of divine omniscience is not just plausible, its mechanism is woven into the very fabric of space and time. This deeply mysterious mechanism is called quantum entanglement, first acknowledged in 1935 by the physicist Albert Einstein, Boris Podolsky, and Nathan Rosen. Verified theoretically in 1964 by physicist John Stuart Bell, and validated experimentally in 1972 by physicists John Clauser and Stuart Friedman. Well, there's a lot of mysteries in this world, and more of them are coming to light. Well, snubbed by President Trump, GOP candidates are fighting for re-election, and they act like they have his backing anyway. President Trump's overall poll numbers are sliding, but among Republicans, the president's approval ratings remain sky high. His grip on the Republican Party, he reshaped over the past decade, remains extremely firm, and his endorsements in GOP primaries are highly influential. Trump endorsements king in any primary, longtime Republican strategist and communicator Jesse Hunt told Fox News. Veteran GOP consultant Matt Gorman highlighted that a Trump endorsement is extremely powerful. It's an undeniable force. So what should a Republican running for re-election who's facing a primary challenge from a Trump-backed candidate do to survive? In two high-profile cases this year, incumbents fighting for their political lives are trying to make it appear the president's supporting them anyway. Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana is facing primary challenges from two Republicans in the next month's primary. Representative Julie Letlow and former Representative John Fleming, who's currently the state treasurer. Trump earlier this year weighed into the race by endorsing Letlow. Cassidy's one of only 7 Senate Republicans who voted in early 2020 to convict Trump after he was impeached by the House for his role in the violent January 6th attack at the U.S. Capitol by supporters who aimed to upend congressional certification of former President Joe Biden's 2020 election victory. President Trump was acquitted by the Senate, of course. Well, he has a long memory. No question about that. Well, let's see. U.S. military is conducting more deadly strikes against vessels of alleged narco-terrorists. U.S. conducted 2 deadly strikes on Saturday against vessels operated by designated terrorist organizations, according to the U.S. Southern Command. Applying a total systemic friction on the cartels, the Sunday night's post on the Southern Command's X account declared. On April 11th, at the direction of Southcom Commander General Francis Donovan, Joint Task Force Southern Spear conducted 2 lethal kinetic strikes on 2 vessels operated by designated terrorist organizations, according to the Post. Intelligence confirmed the vessels were transiting along known narc trafficking routes in the Eastern Pacific or engaged in narco trafficking operations. Post noted that one individual actually survived one of the strikes. Well, I spent 3 years down in that area, and it was no secret who was running drugs. Well, there's a miracle fruit that may help cancer patients overcome chemo side effects that can lead to dangerous weight loss. A small red miracle fruit's gaining attention for its ability to make lemons taste like lemonade and for helping some cancer patients cope with an unpleasant side effect of the treatment. Many chemotherapy patients, chemo mouth can make food taste metallic, bland, or spoiled, leading to weight loss and poor nutrition and reduced motivation to eat. The small red berry, scientifically known as Syncypalum dulciferum, commonly known miracle fruit, is drawing attention for helping patients better tolerate food and in turn reclaim a sense of normalcy. A lot of side effects from cancer treatments are underreported, according to Dr. Mike Kuzner, board-certified medical oncologist and co-director of gastrointestinal malignancies at the Mount Sinai Medical Center in Miami Beach, Florida. He noted that taste changes can become more than a minor inconvenience over time. The alteration in taste ends up giving the patient the sensation everything is absolutely bland. We may think that that's negligible, but it's not that important. But with time, it becomes bothersome to the point where the patient doesn't eat, and that leads to weight loss. Well, I've known a number of people who've come down with cancer, and you've all made mention of that particular aspect. So if they got something to offset that, that's phenomenal. Well, Senator Mitch McConnell has made some comments. He said Hungary's voters offer a lesson for those on the right drawn to Orban. On Sunday, voters in Hungary's parliamentary elections ousted Prime Minister Viktor Orban and his Fidesz party, as polls have consistently predicted they would. Orban's prompt concessions suggest a peaceful democratic transfer of power in the days to come. Most notably, Hungarians appear to have been unswayed by foreign attempts, both real and imaginative, to manipulate their judgment. It shouldn't come as a surprise to Americans. We also bristle at suggestions anybody but our own lawful citizens ought to have a say in our democratic process. And beyond the extreme margins of our politics, there's a little evidence that foreign influence campaigns are very successful in shaping the views of American voters. America's own political leaders have traditionally abided by the idea that politics stopped at the water's edge. They sought to avoid even the appearance of telling other sovereign democracies how to run their internal affairs and resisted the urge to treat foreign policy as an extension of our domestic policies. Well, unfortunately, the left hasn't yet learned that. Well, Cowboy Chef says phones and screens at dinner are tearing American families apart. Cowboy Kent Rollins has spent decades cooking for ranches across America, but his message goes far beyond cast iron pans and campfire tips. Longtime chuck wagon cook and TV personality is urging Americans to put down their phones at the dinner table, saying the habit's taken away from family connections. More people sitting at the table right now, whether it's a restaurant or home, holding a cell phone instead of a fork, according to Rollins, who's based in New Mexico. Well, I've seen a lot of that at restaurants we've gone to. Well, the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz may be the first step toward a more escalatory approach. We'll see what comes of that. Well, Britney Spears has entered rehab after a DUI arrest. I don't know why folks who have everything you could possibly want feel the need to indulge in alcohol and drugs. Well, she voluntarily entered into treatment nearly a month after her arrest for allegedly driving under the influence in her Southern California home. Representative for Spears confirmed to Fox News that the toxic singer voluntarily checked herself into a treatment facility. Circumstances surrounding her care were not immediately made available. She's 44 years old. She was arrested Wednesday, March 4th, and booked for allegedly driving under the influence. She was released about 6:07 in the morning the next day, according to records reviewed by Fox News. The womanizer singer is reportedly spotted driving erratically at a high rate of speed while traveling southbound on the US 101. That's according to the California Highway Patrol. They're able to safely pull her over before conducting a series of field sobriety tests. The dispatch audio obtained by Fox News indicated the California Highway Patrol followed Spears for a while on the freeway and other roads into the greater Los Angeles area before they pulled her over. She had showed signs of impairment, and chemical test results are still pending, according to authorities. But I've seen over-enthusiastic law enforcement also falsely accuse people of driving under the influence. Well, the Masters prize money's never been higher. The first golfer to win the Masters brought home a payday of $1,500. And the iconic green jacket still defines the Masters, but it's the prize money that's never been greater. This year's winner's going to take home a record $4.5 million, payday that separates sharply from the rest of the field. On Saturday, the Masters announced a total purse of $22.5 million. That's an increase of $1.5 million from last year and up $7.5 million from 2022. That's according to the 2022 American Scotty Scheffler won. More than $17 million of this year's total is going to go to the top 15 finishers, with payouts dropping sharply down the leaderboard. Second place earned just a little over $2.4 million. Third place takes home a little more than $1.5 million, and even the golfer that finishes 50 is going to earn $56,700. Oh, I wish I was into golfing. Well, on that note, we're going to get to today's show. We've talked about a lot of strange topics over the various shows. We've done almost 1,400 shows since I began the Ken Hudnall Show. We've talked about some topics that absolutely fascinate folks. Well, the topic we're going to cover today is one that has fascinated me for years. Do you know that every year in this country alone, over 100,000 people vanish? They walk around the corner and never get to the other side. They go out a door and nobody ever sees them again. Now, of course, 7 out of 10 are seeking a poor man's divorce or something like that. But 3 out of 10 have every reason not to vanish, and there's no explanation for what happened to them. Now, I've done a series of books on mysterious disappearances. And in Volume 1, we examined how people vanish and often silence replaces answers. That volume documented patterns, investigations that stalled, explanations that hardened too quickly, and cases that remained open in name only. We're going to start where that inquiry must inevitably lead, because some disappearances are never supposed to remain mysteries. And in these cases, evidence existed, witnesses spoke out, and trails were worn. Suspects were identifiable, but resolution never came. Now, we're not talking about inexplicable vanishings or missing clues lost to time. We're going to talk in this particular instance about decisions, moments when the investigation slowed down or redirected or stopped altogether. It's about cases where the question is no longer what happened, but why nobody followed through. These are not theoretical failures, they're documented failures. We're going to talk about examples of disappearances that should have been solved, or at the very least pursued with sustained urgency. Instead, they were allowed to fade, often quietly, sometimes deliberately, and almost always without accountability. We don't allege a conspiracy, and we don't claim hidden knowledge. We don't pretend certainly where none exist. What we do claim is simpler and more unsettling. When the evidence is present and action actually stops, silence becomes a choice. Now, most disappearance cases grow cold because time erodes the evidence. Witnesses forget, physical traces degrade, memories blur. But some cases grow cold for a different reason. The trail was still warm when the search stopped. We're going to talk about disappearances where the initial conditions favored resolution, where leads existed and timelines were intact and investigative momentum should have carried the case forward. Instead, something changed. Not overnight, not dramatically, quietly. First hours of a disappearance, investigators have advantages they'll never have again. Recent sightings, fresh communications, intact locations, and cooperative witnesses. In many cases examined in this particular episode, these advantages were present. Initial responses were active. Searches were launched. Statements were taken. And then momentum faltered. The reasons vary. Resource constraints, jurisdictional questions, competing priorities, but the outcome is consistent. Urgency dissipated while the opportunity remained. Now, a warm trail doesn't mean certainty. It means a possibility. Among the examples, the last known locations clearly identified. Maybe their vehicles found quickly. Maybe phone activity narrowed timelines. Maybe witnesses who placed the missing person shortly before the disappearance. These conditions should have sharpened focus. Instead, they often were used as justification for the delay, an assumption that answers would emerge on their own. Well, of course, they didn't. In many cases, there's a discernible pivot point. A disappearance initially treated as suspicious is reframed as voluntary. A person of interest becomes a peripheral detail. A lead is downgraded rather than pursued. And this shift rarely comes with new evidence. It comes with interpretation of existing evidence. Once a narrative settles, inquiry narrows, questions that no longer fit the story stop being asked. The case does remain open, but its direction is fixed. When momentum fades too early, losses compound. Witnesses disengage. Memories harden into assumptions. Evidence is deprioritized. Urgency becomes inconvenience. By the time concerns resurface, often driven by families, the case has already slipped into administrative limbo. And at that point, the explanation no longer we're investigating, but we've already looked. Well, the cases we're going to talk about today are linked not by geography or circumstances, but by timing. They share a critical similarity. The opportunity to resolve them existed and wasn't taken. This doesn't require malicious intent by any means. It requires only hesitation, deferral, or misplaced confidence. When responsibility is shared, inaction is easy. The other guy's going to do it. If evidence was present, leads were viable, time hadn't yet erased possibilities, why are these cases stop moving? Well, that's the question asked in almost every case we're going to be looking at. Sometimes the answer lies in institutional caution, sometimes in misclassification, sometimes in competing priorities, and sometimes the answer is simply solving the case is no longer the goal of the intent. Well, among the cases we're going to look at, suspects were known but not pressed, evidence was identified but not tested, confessions were discounted, and jurisdiction became a barrier instead of a bridge. These aren't cases of mystery overtaking reason, they're cases of reason stepping aside. Well, in these particular cases, at the moment the answer is still possible, and choices determined whether those cases would ever be solved, and the person disappeared, never be found. Now, not all evidence disappears. Some of it's collected, logged, and quietly ignored. We're going to talk about disappearance cases where physical or documentary evidence existed early, sometimes within hours or days of the disappearance, but was never fully tested, analyzed, or followed to its logical conclusion. These cases didn't stall because clues were absent. They stalled because the effort to pursue the clues stopped. In many investigations, the act of collecting evidence is mistaken for progress. Maybe a phone is recovered or a car is found. Clothing is logged in. Once items are secured, urgency fades, the evidence exists, the box is checked. But possession of evidence is not analysis, and collection is not pursuit. In the cases we're going to talk about, evidence was present, but its implications were left unexplored. Modern disappearance cases often include one critical artifact, a mobile phone. They're ubiquitous. Almost everyone has one. These phones record locations and contacts and timelines and patterns of behavior. In several cases, these phones are recovered quickly. But the analysis of the phone stopped at service level review. Location data was never fully mapped. Contacts weren't exhaustively traced. Deleted data wasn't recovered. The explanation offered later was usually practical. Limited resources, lack of warrant authority, or perceived irrelevance. But the result was the same. A powerful source of information was underused or even ignored. And vehicles are among the most revealing pieces of evidence in disappearance cases. They provide travel intent and timing and signs of struggle or staging, or even the relevance of who was present. In numerous cases, vehicles were located within days. Some showed inconsistencies, unusual placement, unexplained damage, personal items left behind. But forensic testing was limited. Follow-up was minimal. In some cases, the vehicles returned to the family before questions were resolved. The assumption once again replaced inquiry. How about clothing or other belongings? Clothing recovered in disappearance cases often carries more information than its presence suggests. Condition matters, location matters. What's missing matters. But clothing is frequently treated as confirmation of loss rather than as a source of inquiry. Once logged in, it becomes symbolic rather than investigative. In the cases we're going to talk about, clothing was used to support a conclusion, not to test one. Evidence that fits a developing narrative is pursued. Evidence that complicates it is often deferred or ignored. This pattern recurs across jurisdictions. When physical findings raise questions inconsistent with the working assumption or explanation, voluntary departure or misadventure or accident, those questions are softened rather than sharpened. Testing would require escalation. Escalation requires justification. Justification invites scrutiny. And it's expensive, don't you know? Time is often cited as the enemy of investigation. In the cases we're going to talk about in this episode, time was available early on and not used. Opportunities were missed, not because years passed, but because days did. By the time urgency returned, the explanation was already set. Now, you might ask yourself why evidence actually goes untested. And it's rarely a single reason. Sometimes it's workload. Sometimes it's jurisdictional uncertainty. Sometimes it's misplaced confidence. But across cases, one factor dominates. Once a plausible explanation exists, the incentive to disprove it diminishes. Evidence becomes a formality rather than a tool. In record keeping, if you've got a viable explanation, you've solved the case. You look brilliant. Whether the person you're looking for is found or not, you come out looking like a hero. Untested evidence doesn't prove misconduct, though. It does reveal priorities. When analysis stops prematurely, it signals that resolution is no longer the goal. Stability is. And the cases we're going to talk about continue on paper, but momentum has ended when a viable explanation is found. Doesn't make any difference if it's true or not. If evidence existed and was never fully examined, the mystery is not why answers were elusive. The mystery is why the questions were allowed to fade. That question carries forward into what we're talking about in this episode, where the issue is no longer evidence, but people. Well, in some disappearance cases, the problem is not a lack of suspects, it's that a suspect existed early on, was identified clearly, and then was quietly allowed to drift out of focus. These cases didn't fail because investigators were blind, they failed because attention was withdrawn. We're going to examine how suspects are deprioritized, neutralized, or quietly removed from consideration. Not by being exonerated, oh no, but by exhaustion and caution and institutional discomfort. In most disappearance investigations, suspects emerge quickly. They're often not strangers to the person that's vanished. They're people already woven into the missing person's life, such as partners or former partners or family members or close associates, co-workers, financial contacts. And the reason is simple. Opportunity favors proximity. Early case files frequently reflect this. Names are listed, relationships are mapped, tensions are documented. In some cases, investigators correctly recognize disappearance doesn't occur in a vacuum. But then as the investigation continues, something changes. Once a suspect is identified, investigators face an immediate dilemma. Pursuing that suspect aggressively may escalate the conflict, generate public scrutiny, expose investigative error, require resources are already strained. No law enforcement agency has all the money that they need for their job. The alternative is more comfortable: containment. Suspects are reflamed as persons of interest. Their relevance is acknowledged but softened. Language shifts subtly but decisively. What was once concerning becomes unverified. What was once suspicious becomes inconclusive. Suspect remains in the file, of course, but it's no longer at its center. And motive is often established early and then quietly dismissed. Arguments are documented, threats are reported, financial stress is noted. But motive alone rarely compels sustained pressure. Investigators frequently reclassify motive as contextual rather than causal. Heated argument becomes common relationship conflict. A threat becomes emotional language. Financial desperation becomes stress, not intent. The motive doesn't disappear, its significance does. Well, opportunity should narrow the inquiry. Being the last person to see the missing individual alive is not a trivial thing. It's a factual advantage that demands scrutiny. But in many cases, opportunity becomes an explanation rather than a prompt. Statements are accepted. I dropped them off. They left on their own. I went to sleep. They were upset. These statements are recorded, not tested. Verification is partial. Contradictions are noted but not pressed. The explanation is allowed to stand because challenging it would require confrontation. Familiar suspects benefit from institutional hesitation. Investigators are trained explicitly and implicitly to avoid unnecessary disruption of families and close relationships. Of course, the intention is humane. The effect can be corrosive. Pressing a familiar suspect risks alienating witnesses, provoking legal challenges, or escalating emotionally volatile situations. As a result, familiarity becomes a shield. The closer the relationship, the greater the reluctance to pursue. This reluctance is framed as restraint. In practice, it's avoidance. In many cases, investigation of a suspect consists of a single interview. Questions are asked, answers are given, notes are taken. Once the interview ends, momentum dissipates. There's no sustained follow-up, no timeline reconstruction, no verification of alibis beyond surface checks. Suspect's cooperation becomes a proxy for innocence. An interview is not an investigation. It's just the opening move in an investigation. Investigators are human. Institutions are risk-averse, many times. Pursuing a suspect aggressively invites error, creates accountability, and increases the chance of getting it wrong. In disappearance cases, where evidence may already be thin, the perceived risk of action can outweigh the perceived benefit. Especially where the suspect appears calm, the explanation sounds plausible, the narrative is stabilizing, and the case lacks public pressure. In these conditions, restraint becomes policy. Once pressure stops, suspects don't disappear physically. They disappear administratively. Their names appear less frequently in reports. Their relevance is downgraded. Their actions are no longer scrutinized. The investigation continues around them. Searches expand, theories multiply. The original focal point fades. The case does remain open. The inquiry doesn't. Leaving a suspect alone doesn't prove guilt, but it does reveal priorities. Reveals how discomfort and caution and institutional incentives shape outcomes more powerfully than evidence does. Reveals how an investigation can fail without error simply by stopping short. Absence of pursuit becomes a decision. If a suspect was identified, never fully examined, the question is not whether they were responsible. The question is why responsibility was never tested. That question leads directly to our next topic, where the issue is no longer suspects, but information that arrived, pointed clearly, and is quietly set aside. In many disappearance cases, the hardest problem is not finding information, it's deciding what to do with it. Families often imagine that if only the right tip arrived, if only somebody saw something, remembered something, or spoke up, then the case would pivot to a resolution. Sometimes that belief is justified. Tips do arrive that should redirect the entire investigation. But then nothing happens. We're going to examine the disappearance cases where a meaningful tip emerged, specific, time-sensitive, and potentially decisive, but was ignored, delayed, downgraded, or absorbed into the file without follow-through. These cases don't remain unsolved because nobody knew anything. They remain unsolved because the system failed to act when the window was opened. Now, most tips are just noise. They're well-intentioned but vague, generated by anxiety, rumor, or distant association. Investigators grow numb to them. A missing poster triggers hundreds of calls. Social media generates thousands of theories. Almost all of them are unusable. But occasionally a tip arrives with features that separate it from noise. It may have specificity, a location, a vehicle, a direction of travel, a time. Maybe proximity, somebody close enough to plausibly witness the event. And consistency, details that align with known timelines. How about risk? Maybe the tipster's nervous, reluctant, or afraid, suggesting consequence. And verifiability, details that can be tested quickly. These are the tips that should trigger action. Instead, too often they trigger just paperwork. In many cases, a tip is received and documented, it's entered into the system, it's put in a file, and it's stamped with a date and time. It's assigned a number. The case appears to progress, but logging a tip is not the same as acting on it. Action requires decisions. Who's responsible? Who has jurisdiction? What resources will be spent? And whether the tip aligns with the prevailing narrative. And that last factor, of course, can be the most dangerous. What happens when a tip challenges the narrative? Disappearance investigations often solidify around an early explanation. It may be a voluntary departure, or a misadventure, or a mental health crisis, or an accident, or even an environmental loss. Once this explanation becomes the default, tips are not evaluated solely on merit. They're evaluated against the story the case has already chosen. If a tip fits the narrative, it's treated as confirmation. If it challenges the narrative, it becomes inconvenient. In these cases, tips are not disproven, they're deprioritized. The investigation protects its story more than it tests it. Some tips are ignored because following them forces escalation. A tip that implies foul play demands a wider search, more forensic work, subpoenas or warrants, interagency involvement, media attention, or maybe accountability for prior assumptions. Escalation is expensive, not only financially but institutionally. It creates pressure. It generates risk. It invites scrutiny. When an organization is already leaning toward closure, escalation becomes the thing to avoid. So the tip is softened. It's referred to as unconfirmed or unable to verify, not consistent with evidence, no further information at this time. These phrases often mean only one thing. The organization has chosen not to pursue that particular tip. And there's a time problem nobody wants to admit. A decisive tip is often time-sensitive. A vehicle seen in the wrong place, a person spotted in transit, a scream heard, a disturbance observed, phone location pings. The value of these tips collapses with delay. Hours matter, days ruin leads, weeks bury them. But institutional responses frequently moves at an administrative speed. Forms are completed, calls are routed, a detective is assigned. Later. A supervisor reviews it. Later. A warrant is discussed. Later. The case becomes a sequence of handoffs. And by the time action is authorized, the opportunity is gone. Families often report the same experience. They provide a tip, they receive reassurance, they wait, and nothing happens. When they follow up, they're told, we looked into it, we didn't find anything, it's not consistent with what we know, we don't have enough resources. But families learn the difference between being investigated and acknowledged. A tip can be looked into in the weakest possible way. A single phone call is made, a quick drive-by, a note that nobody answered, a statement that the location was too broad. From the family's perspective, nothing has happened. From the institution's perspective, the tip has been processed. That's how trust collapsed, not in a single moment, but in repeated quiet dismissals. Let's talk about the anatomy of a lost tip. Across cases, the same pattern seems to appear. The tip arrives with specificity. The tip is logged and routed. Ownership becomes unclear. Follow-up is delayed. Narrative bias reduces urgency. The window of opportunity closes. Tip becomes unverifiable, and the case returns to the confused state. This process can happen without malice, but it doesn't happen without responsibility. Has to also be said, sometimes tips are ignored because the institution doesn't want what they might reveal. A tip can expose a suspect close to local power. Negligence by officials, mishandled evidence, prior investigative failure, or even jurisdictional embarrassment. When a tip threatens the institution itself, silence becomes self-protective. This doesn't require conspiracy, it requires human incentives. Avoiding shame is a powerful motivator, and in disappearance cases, shame is often easier to avoid than the truth is. Ignoring a decisive tip doesn't always mean to corruption. It does mean something else, though. It means a system has drifted from investigation into management. Once a case is managed rather than pursued, the goal becomes stability. There are fewer demands, fewer surprises, fewer accountability triggers, and tips are treated as disruptions. And disruption is the enemy of closure. The meaning of the tip arrived and was ignored. The question is not whether the tip should have solved the case or would have solved the case. The question is why the system allowed the possibility of resolution to expire. And that question leads into what we're going to talk about next, where the problem is no longer the tips, suspects, or evidence. It's classification. Because some cases do not go unsolved. They're filed away under labels that ensure they'll never be pursued again. Now, not every disappearance is solved. Some are simply renamed. We're going to discuss how disappearance cases are reclassified in ways that end inquiry without resolving uncertainty. The classifications often sound neutral, even compassionate. In practice, they function as administrative endpoints, labels that quiet investigation while preserving the appearance of action. The case doesn't close, the questions do. Classification actually shapes behavior. Once a disappearance is labeled a certain way, every subsequent decision flows from that designation. Resources shift, priorities change, expectations narrow. The case's future is determined less by evidence than by the words used to describe it. Common classifications include voluntary departure, misadventure, mental health-related disappearances, accidental loss, non-suspicious absence. Now, none of these labels require proof of any type. They require plausibility, and plausibility is quite often enough. Voluntary departure is one of the most powerful classifications in disappearance investigations. It suggests agency, it implies intent, it reduces urgency, and once applied, it shifts responsibility away from the investigators. If a person chose to leave, then searching becomes optional rather than imperative. In many cases, this classification is assigned despite the absence of planning indicators. No financial preparation, no goodbye communications, no history disappearance. Belongings left behind. The contradiction is noted and then dismissed. Voluntary departure becomes a hypothesis that's treated as a fact. Mental health history is frequently used as a closing mechanism rather than a factor requiring deeper inquiry. Depression becomes inevitability. Anxiety becomes instability. Stress becomes motive. The presence of a diagnosis or even a speculation often shifts the investigative burden. Rather than prompting concern, it would justify withdrawal. This is not only inaccurate, it's dangerous. Mental health does not eliminate the possibility of foul play. It doesn't explain disappearance. It doesn't substitute for evidence. But once it's invoked, it silences urgency. Now, misadventure classifications rely heavily on the environment. Wilderness, perhaps, maybe water or weather or the terrain. The explanations are often plausible, especially in remote areas. But plausibility is not confirmation. In many cases, environmental explanations are applied without physical remains or personal effects or even forensic confirmation. Excuse me. The environment absorbs responsibility. And once the land is blamed for the disappearance, nobody else has to answer. Then we've got the administrative appeal of reclassification. Reclassification often offers institutions several advantages. It reduces the workload. It limits resource expenditure. It avoids escalation. It quiets public pressure. It protects prior assumptions. Most importantly, it allows the case to remain technically open while functionally inactive. System can say, we didn't close the case, we just didn't pursue it any longer. Once a case is reclassified, reversing that decision is difficult. New evidence has to overcome not just uncertainty, but institutional inertia. Investigators have to admit the original classification may have been premature or even wrong. That admission carries cost. As a result, even contradictory information is often forced to fit the existing label rather than prompting reevaluation. The classification hardens. The case ossifies. Now, families feel the impact immediately. Once a case is reclassified, updates slow, communication becomes vague, investigative actions diminish. Families are told the case is still open, but the disappearance is palpable. They learn the label has ended the search, even if nobody says so out loud. This is often the moment when families begin their own investigation, not out of defiance, but out of necessity. Now, reclassification rarely requires external review. There's no independent check, no formal hearing, no obligation to justify beyond internal documentation. A supervisor approves it, a box is checked off on a form. The case moves into quiet suspension. The absence of oversight makes classification an extraordinarily powerful tool. Now, reclassification does not prove error by any means, but it does reveal how uncertainty is managed. When answers are elusive, the system reaches for labels that restore order, even if it don't restore the truth. The disappearance becomes administratively complete while remaining unresolved. If a case was reclassified without proof, the question is not whether the label is reasonable. The question is whether reason replaced investigation. And that question is elected to what we're going to talk about next, where the issue is no longer classification, but the moment the search itself ends. Now, searches don't always end with an announcement. There's rarely a press conference declaring that all reasonable revenues have been exhausted. There's no formal moment when investigators gather and agree that nothing more will be done. In many disappearance cases, the end comes without ceremony. It slows, fragments, and then fades until activity becomes indistinguishable from absence. We're going to examine how searches conclude, not through a resolution, but through attrition. In the early days of a disappearance, efforts are often conspicuous. Search teams assemble. Maps are marked. Dogs are deployed. Volunteers arrive. Updates are frequent. Visibility creates reassurance. It signals commitment. It suggests the momentum exists and that time is being used well. For families, this phase is exhausting but hopeful. It looks like action. Then gradually the signals change. The transition is subtle, of course. Search grids shrink, updates become less specific, daily briefings stop, activity shifts from fieldwork to paperwork. The language changes as well. Instead of searching, officials start talking about monitoring. Instead of canvassing, they speak about following up. Instead of expanding, they talk about maintaining awareness. You can hear the peanut gallery tuning up in the background. The work becomes less visible. That invisibility is often mistaken for continuity. Searches end because resources move elsewhere. Another case emerges. Another crisis demands attention. Personnel are reassigned. Nobody announces the shift. It just happens through scheduling and prioritization. Each change is small enough to seem reasonable. Taken together, though, they're decisive. The disappearance remains unresolved, but it no longer competes successfully for time. Investigators often cite diminishing returns as justification for slowing searches. And of course, the argument is pragmatic. Areas have been covered, evidence has not emerged, and leads are exhausted. But diminishing returns assume that the correct avenues are pursued thoroughly in the first place. In many cases, search areas were selected based on early assumptions that later hardened into fact. Once those assumptions were wrong, returns diminished not because answers were absent, but because the search was misdirected. At a certain point, continuing searching becomes symbolic rather than investigative. A patrol drives by a known location or a flyer is updated. A database entry remains active. These actions preserve the appearance of effort without demanding renewed strategy. The search exists, but it no longer evolves. Families most always know when a search has ended. They notice longer gaps between calls, vague responses, fewer concrete actions, repeated reassurance without substance. They begin to hear the same phrases over and over. There's nothing new right now. We're still keeping an eye out. We'll let you know if anything changes. What families understand is that nothing will change unless they make it change. Ending a search outright carries consequences. It invites criticism. It creates finality. It demands an explanation. Allowing a search to fade avoids these costs. No decision has to be defended. No threshold has to be met. No responsibility has to be claimed. The case remains open in theory, but even as effort evaporates in practice. A search that fades does something uniquely painful to families. It offers no closure. It provides no explanation. It doesn't even provide an ending. Hope lingers without support. Grief is prolonged without resolution. Families are left to wonder not only what happened to their loved ones, but when the system decided to stop looking. And that uncertainty is its own form of harm. When searches ended quickly, it's rarely because all options have been exhausted. It's more often because the system's reached a point of comfort with uncertainty. The disappearances become manageable, not solved by any means, but actually contained. And on that note, we come to the end of today's show. We'll be talking more about mysterious disappearances in tomorrow's show. Until then, this is Ken Hudnall for the Ken Hudnall Show saying have a truly great evening.